Good afternoon. My name is Jerome Hsiang, and I'm the chairman of the Young Professionals program of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council in Town Hall. I would like to welcome all of our audience members today to our webinar, Globalization After 2020, Reset or Retrench. Now, before we get to the fun stuff, I do have to cover a few logistical issues. For those of you joining us online, we will be taking questions from you in about 25 minutes. You should see a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen with an area for questions that you can type into. When the Q&A portion starts, we will be joined by Claire Krelitz, the Council's Marketing and Communications Director. Claire will read your questions and endeavor to get to as many as she can. Our speaker today is Brian Peck, Director of the Center for Transnational Law and Business at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. Brian served as Deputy Director in charge of International Affairs and Business Development for Governor Jerry Brown's Office of Business and Economic Development from 2013 to 2016. Before that, he was an international trade and intellectual property attorney, advising multinational clients on international trade, regulatory and compliance matters, international government and policy affairs, global IP asset management, and trade-related IP matters. Brian was also the Senior Director for Intellectual Property at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office from 2003 to 2005, and Director of Japanese Affairs at USTR from 2001 to 2003. He was the lead negotiator for the intellectual property chapters in several free trade agreements. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Jerome. Nice to see you again. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And also, before we get started, I'd like to thank the LA World Affairs Council and Town Hall for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. Thank you.
Great. So globalization seems like an immensely vast topic that it may be useful for us to break it down into some of its component pieces first so we know what we're talking about. Generally speaking, there are basically three conceptual parts to globalization. There's the economic, the political, and the cultural aspects of it. Now, each of these facets involve the growing interdependence among people and nations of the world. Since the WTO was established in 1995 and the previous GATT agreements as well, it seems that globalization was seen as an inevitable outcome of the movement of capital, goods, and people. But more recently, we have seen that globalization has come under increasing scrutiny, both in the United States as well as around the world. And even though the title of this webinar is Globalization After 2020, I actually think it makes sense to go back in time a little bit to take a look at how some of the current trends got started. So let me take us back a little bit to 1999, when the World Trade Organization held its ministerial conference in Seattle. Now, at that ministerial conference, no fewer than 40,000 protesters showed up in Seattle to protest everything from free trade to environmental issues, such as the destruction of sea turtle habitats. And it seemed to a lot of observers that this was a watershed moment when it became clear that grassroots opposition to globalization had real political power in the United States. Now, fast forward to 2021, and it seems to me that many of the concerns around globalization remain exactly the same. Do you think we've reached an inflection point for globalization? Does the pandemic and the literal distancing of people and all that it entails mean that we are also conceptually turning inward as a nation and as a world?
I think the events over the past few years have certainly reversed the trend towards, kind of all no holds barred globalization that we saw, in the 2000s. But I think globalization is not dead. I think it's going to be modified. I think current conditions have exacerbated the inward trend that you've mentioned about, both in terms of the rise of nationalism and populism in our domestic politics over the past 4 years, as well as the pandemic exacerbating the need to, bring back manufacturing, to localize supply chains, to protect national security in terms of health, the health situations caused by the pandemic. But I don't think globalization is dead. I think we're going to see kind of a modified version of it. You've got a new president that is a staunch multilateralist by nature, and that is a strong supporter of international organizations and alliances. So I think that under that leadership and under the need for, I think, a multilateral approach to, at least on the economic front, to deal and address some of the concerns that are being raised. For example, the relationship with China and inequities in the global trading system, it will need some sort of multilateral approach, although not in the reigns that we've seen, prior to the Trump administration's years.
So in terms of a multilateral approach to trade, there was a time when I think a lot of trade scholars, or especially international business scholars, wanted to think about trade as almost like a separate realm from the politics and the geostrategic side of things. But it seems to me that the past 4 years in the Trump administration has made it very clear that the US is going to increasingly tie trade and geostrategic concerns together. It seems that there are three power blocks right now. There's the US, there's the EU, and there's China, the three major players in international trade right now. And the relations between these three have gotten more tense, with obviously the US-China trade war, but also the US-EU frictions over a number of trade issues, whether it's Airbus, Boeing, or just generally the idea of strategic autonomy that the EU has been pursuing. When we talk about multilateral cooperation, are we talking about all nations coming together, all three of these power blocks coming together? Or are we talking about more like these dyads? So for example, the US and the EU might come together, or China and the African Union might get closer, or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's more going to be the latter. Although I think they will expand beyond dyads. For example, both Biden prior, when he was a candidate for president, and early statements from his trade policy team officials, a team that that have been nominated, and Boris Johnson in the UK have said the same thing, that they seek to build up a coalition of democratic economic markets led by democracies as a way to address on a multilateral front, again, concerns being raised by China's trade practices and policies. So I think it will be regionalized between the three power blocks. And then, for example, the US would work with the EU, but also say with Japan, Korea, India, and other like-minded democracies. But it won't be a complete, pure model of multilateralism. One other point you raised, Jerome, I think is interesting is you're right. I mean, President Trump was really the first president to fully integrate trade policy with national security policy. But in terms of although as you say, trade scholars, the pure trade scholars want to separate economic policy from geopolitical strategic policy, and separate trade from geopolitical policy. As far back as the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, a lot of those free trade agreements, and there was a rash of them, that's like 12 of them in his 8 years of presidency, which was a record. It still is for the number of FTAs negotiated under administration. A lot of those, if you look at the FTA partners, for example, like Oman, Bahrain, Morocco, Costa Rica, the Central American states, Colombia, they were done just not so much for economic policy, but more for geopolitical strategy, whether it was combating terrorism in the Middle East, trying to bring stability to the Middle East, whether it was drug interdiction and helping Colombia with the drug wars. So there was that mixture of geopolitical and trade policy has been in place for many administrations, but it was clearly enunciated and integrated fully under the Trump administration.
Now, one of the things that I think the Biden administration, some people have been expecting the Biden administration to do, is to return to something that looks more like an Obama administration approach to trade and geopolitics. For those of us who don't remember how long 4 years ago was, President Obama did sort of negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership partially as a way to cement the United States as part of the Pacific region economically. But today it seems like the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be, or I guess the new comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership would be a hard sell, even in the United States, even with a Democratic-led government. And furthermore, I believe it was just on Monday that President Biden actually signaled that they will continue at least the holding pattern when it comes to the World Trade Organization appellate judges, and continuing a policy of both President Trump and President Obama. Given some of these moves, what forms are available to the United States to actually pursue multilateral policy for trade? If we just want reform for the WTO, how can we actually use that forum for our ends?
Okay, so a couple of things you raised, Jerome, which I appreciate. On the CPTPP, I think I agree with you. It's going to be a hard sell, not only among the American public, but even within the Democratic Party. But that being said, I think the advantages of rejoining joining the new CPTPP will be very attractive to Biden's administration for a couple of reasons. One is it's a regional agreement, so it's a multilateral approach. It rebalances the tipping sphere of influence that China has gained through this RCEP version of TPP. It would restore a balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region between the two economic giants. It would reestablish and reaffirm alliances with traditional U.S. allies in the region: Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. So I think it'd be attractive for him to do so. I think in order to be successful in rejoining the CPTPP, is that they would probably have to renegotiate certain provisions, particularly on labor and environment, similar to what they did for the USMCA. When the USMCA was signed by the Trump administration, the Democrats negotiated with the administration on strengthening certain protections for labor rights and environmental protection provisions that made it palatable to the Democratic Party and allowed it to pass Congress last year and go into effect last year. I think they would have to do a similar type of exercise to get the CPTPP to move forward. But I think the advantages and the pros of reestablishing U.S. leadership, balancing Chinese increasing sphere of influence, reassuring and strengthening traditional allies in the region would be too much of an attraction for the Biden administration not to at least seriously consider it, if not pursue it. In WTO reform, I think, as you mentioned, I mean, at least initially, I think when it comes to multilateral institutions, when it comes to like the Trump tariffs on China, they're putting them in a holding pattern. They're not immediately removing them until they can study them more carefully. But again, Biden throughout his whole political career is a staunch multilateralist, that supports very strong international institutions, including the WTO. I think they're going to try to find a constructive way to bring about reform, because I think they view that as a necessary and important organization to facilitate, governance of a rules-based multilateral trading system, including using it as a tool to combat and again contest and address concerns of Chinese economic and trade policies that have a detrimental effect on the global economy. I think they can see the WTO reform as a platform of that once they can build a consensus and reestablish leadership along with, say, blocs like the EU and others to seek out, legitimate reform.
So could you speak briefly about some of the differences between the US position and the EU position when it comes to the World Trade Organization? It seems like not only do we have we have a lot of pushback from countries like China when it comes to some of the reforms, but the EU is also only beginning to truly seriously take the idea of WTO reform. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I mean, one thing, whether you agree or disagree with Trump administration's approach towards the WTO, and again, keep in mind that he himself personally did not like the organization. It's threatened a few times to withdraw the U.S. from the WTO. His dislike for multilateral organizations in general. I think, his then U.S. Trade Representative Lighthouser was sincere, if you will, in seeking legitimate, actual substantive reform and not just some window dressing. I think, so if we either agree with his administration's policies and approach towards the WTO, I think the one benefit that everyone could agree on is that it woke the rest of the world up. I think, until that, the Trump administration's actions toward the WTO, a lot of the members, including the EU, would just kind of say, yeah, we need reform, but nothing's going to happen. The status quo is sufficient. Let it, go as it may, and not try to rock the boat too much by taking some aggressive actions that the Trump administration did. So I think that policy of the last 4 years has wakened the world up, as I mentioned, and kind of made members such as the EU membership realize that they need to be more aggressive and take on, really hard issues in making substantive reforms that will have a real, positive impact on terms of the organization as an institution and in terms of addressing areas of concern, particularly with China. And then also, developing new agreements that are appropriate for the new economy, whether it's digital trade, whether it's environmental and trade, I think the approaches are starting to converge in terms of U.S. intent for real reform and the necessary efforts that are required by the EU and other large blocs.
So when it comes to this reform effort, whether it's the WTO or just the entire sort of trading system in general, there must be a little bit of a race or competition to see who will be leading this effort, so to speak. And one very large party seems to be poking everyone, and that's China, and really getting everyone on board with with acting on this. And right now, I know that China and Australia have been in sort of a trade spat for a little bit of time now. And China appears to be using a fairly aggressive diplomatic and trade business strategy to try to coerce Australia into certain concessions. So my question to begin with on this side of the topic is, are we seeing China sort of proactively trying to provoke the Western powers into either some sort of a mistake or some kind of a policy change? It doesn't seem to make any sense to me, because I think China thinks the WTO arrangement is great. So why move the West towards that?
I think what you're seeing with Australia is, and President Xi has been, I think, pretty vocal about wanting China, having the rest of the world recognize, especially the Western world, recognize that China is an equal, economically, geopolitically. And I think they're using Australia as an example of what they can do, and using their economic muscle and their growing sphere of influence in the Asia-Pacific region on a country that, frankly, is somewhat more vulnerable to such, provocative actions, simply because Australia relies so much on China for its export markets. It's its #1 trading partner. It's a source of revenue in terms of for several of its industries and sectors. So, China can hurt Australia by taking the actions that it's done in terms of tariffs and trade restrictions that it's imposed so far. So I think they're using this as kind of showing this as an example of what they can do, in large part, again, to try to command respect of the growing influence and, as I say, economic power and geopolitical influence and power that China feels it believes is its place in the world. I think that's a large part of it. I think a lot of it too is trying to show that because of Australia, in China's view, took certain actions, whether it was with regard to trade or they put restrictions on terms of Chinese investment in universities and so forth like that. Australia took a lot of actions that basically upset China, and China felt was discriminatory against China's interest or contrary to China's interest. And so they're showing their ability that they're not going to sit back anymore, that they're going to take an active role in matching any sort of action it feels that it goes against its interest or is critical of China, and showing that they have the wherewithal to do so. So I think you're seeing this as an example of what China, I think, is moving towards for those reasons.
Should we be concerned that they will extend some of these aggressive tactics to some of the other countries? Maybe the United States is a little too big for China to effectively coerce this way, but on the other hand, there's Canada, there's the United Kingdom, the now non-EU United Kingdom, and also the fact that the EU has just signed that investment agreement with, agreed to the investment agreement with China.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
So just on the last point you raised, just quickly as a side note, that's a very interesting example, I think, of what we'll see in the next few years in terms of your earlier point about where globalization or multilateralism will go. Will it be regional, kind of partnerships, say, between the EU and the US? I think one of the consequences of the Trump administration's treatment of EU, both in terms of alliance and economic and trade policy and so forth like that, and the antagonistic approach that it took, is that the EU, I think, again, just historically and economically, are much more integrated and natural partners in when it comes to trade and geopolitical issues. But they're doing so, I think, and would approach any reapproachment that the Biden administration will certainly attempt in rebuilding the alliances, and whether it's in trade policy or other areas. But they will do it so with a strategic autonomy. I think it's important to note that Biden administration, even before inauguration day, specifically expressed or requested the EU to hold off on signing the China-EU investment agreement until the Biden administration came into power and had a chance to work with the EU. But the EU went ahead and signed it off anyway. And so you've got this, I think, willingness and a natural affinity for building a stronger relationship or rebuilding a stronger relationship in a multilateral approach from the regional level, but with a more kind of an arm's length strategic autonomy in place as well. And I think that's going to be the tone of that type of alliances in the future, rather than just kind of a lockstep type of approach that we saw, prior to the Trump administration. In terms of, whether we should be concerned, I think yes, definitely. And again, I think the U.S. is a big enough market and big enough economic power where it can kind of go toe to toe, at least for now, with China. But I think they certainly could take advantage of other trading partners that are more vulnerable, as they say, in terms of the reliance on the Chinese market, either for that country's exports or for raw materials or other components that are necessary for that trading partner's economic sectors. I personally think that the relationship with China, certainly with the U.S., but with other countries, I call it the 3 C's. There's going to be confrontation, which we see with the Australia-China trade war and the U.S.-China trade war. Competition, economic competition, especially in the tech sector, and collaboration, areas such as climate change and public health management, where there's common areas of interest. I think that over the next few years, especially under the Biden administration, is going to be a combination of confrontation, competition, and collaboration.
So one of the areas, specific industry areas that I think we will see as having a lot of competition going forward is in technology-related matters. And specifically, I think there is a huge race among the different countries for progress on semiconductor technology and fabrication and whatnot. And China has an advantage or disadvantage, depending on your theoretical orientation, of being funded, or Chinese companies have the advantage of being funded by the government. And the government has the ability to come up with these 5-year plans, 10-year plans, or whatever it is they want to call it. And some in the United States have, and the EU, have called for more of a return to an industrial policy, or actually, I don't want to say return, taking up a proactive industrial policy to promote some of our tech sectors. Is this a realistic option for the United States? We know economic theory tells us all sorts of reasons why industrial policy might not actually be good when it comes to competition and therefore innovation, and yet we still see this push. What do you think about the possibilities of this happening?
I think it's already happening. The Biden administration is already committed to spending $3 billion investing in U.S.-based R&D, in the high-tech sectors of critical importance: semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, electric vehicles. So we've already seen it happening in terms of taking positive steps to favor certain sectors or to support, what everyone, as you mentioned, considers to be the future. That's the tech sectors. The EU is also, as both member states and as a customs union, are taking steps to nurture, digital technology companies and other tech companies to try to, they feel they've fallen behind the U.S. and China in terms of these areas, and they're trying to nurture, startup businesses to build up, their technological prowess. You're also seeing it on the defensive side. The Trump administration a couple of years ago blocked the acquisition of Qualcomm by Broadcom, which is now a Singapore-based company. And it wasn't based so much on, seeing Singapore or Broadcom as a national security threat. What the threat they saw was that Broadcom was well known for being very cost-cutting enterprise, and they were afraid that if Broadcom took over Qualcomm, Qualcomm being a leader in 5G technology, is that they would slash Qualcomm's R&D budget, putting it at a disadvantage to continue to maintain its superiority in 5G technology. The leading 5G technology coming from the United States, and that was the concern. Was protecting and maintaining that there were still financial resources and technology and prowess to protect U.S. companies to maintain their leadership in certain tech sectors. You got the CFIUS process, again, looking very carefully at investments or acquisitions of U.S. technology companies, both here in the U.S., but now you're seeing the EU and the UK in particular developing their own, or emboldening their CFIUS processes to protect their tech companies or other strategically important companies and sectors from foreign investment, particularly from China. So I think that industrial policy in terms of nurturing champions, particularly in the tech sector, I think is already happening.
So I wanted to, I'm trying to think of a good segue for this. I don't think, and I'm not coming up with a good one right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask this question, which is, and I promise it's related to the technology stuff that we just talked about. Traditionally, economists have thought of integration, whether it's trade or technology or cultural, as a way for some of these non-Western or non-developed countries, a path to economic prosperity, essentially hooking into the global economic order and allowing them to sell their goods to other countries. Now, in the past half an hour, it seems like we're talking about a world in which countries are increasingly looking inward. They are looking at the companies as national assets, so to speak, and strategic resources. Now, I read something that was kind of interesting to me just a couple of days ago, which is that China apparently has decided to increase its purchases of cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo tremendously over the past year. And there is some speculation that cobalt, which is a key, absolutely key material for telecommunications and semiconductors, that China is trying to essentially stockpile cobalt for a future conflict with the United States. And it turns out that the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the few places in the world with substantial cobalt deposits. And so my question is that as developing countries see that countries are increasingly turning inward and talking about whether it's supporting their own domestic industries, bringing jobs back to America, China, or whatever, does this open the room for developing countries with resources to become much more strategic in what they do with their natural resources to support one bloc over the other?
Oh, very much so. In the past, kind of the prevailing practice was that developed countries that needed natural resources from developing or least developed countries would come in, and it'd be a simple transaction, and the developing country would think it was benefiting from the revenue that was being generated by the extraction of its natural resources. I think the developing countries have become much more sophisticated in that manner, and now can realize they can utilize their natural resources that are needed by the power of the developed countries, and that have a huge appetite for these natural resources as strategic leverage to get something more in return than just revenue from the extraction. So I definitely think that is very real, and you're going to see that more and more. I think also, though, in terms of developing countries trying to get more integrated in the global economy, as you see, if indeed countries are turning more inward, what are some other paths, if you will, that developing or least developed countries can utilize, if any, to try to become more integrated? Because as you said, historically, although there were some disparities between developing and least developed and developed countries in terms of the global economic order, I think most everyone would agree that, for example, with the WTO going into effect, most of its members being least developed or developing countries have all benefited from the economic growth that has resulted from multilateral trading system that liberalizes our markets and minimizes trade restrictive measures. So I think given the kind of the inoperability or the ineffectiveness of the WTO at this point, and given the inward turning of developed countries, what is left for them? I think there are a couple areas. One is, as you say, the strategic leverage that they can use when they have natural resources that are in high demand is one. I think one way that you could do that is in return is to require or attract foreign direct investment in terms of developing infrastructure or developing industries in these developing countries that would create jobs, that would bring about economic growth. I think another methodology or platform for developing countries would be to seek out, again, as you said, these regional powers or these regional blocks, seek out free trade agreements with these regional blocks. And indeed, you're seeing that now with the EU and some of the Latin American countries and African countries, and even with China, working with developing countries and establishing these free trade agreements that, again, create market opportunities, utilizing the resources they have, and markets that could be created and industries to be created through these agreements. And I think kind of almost in an ironic way, as I mentioned, the majority of members of the WTO are developing and least developed countries. I think they, this might be a platform for them to work more, proactively in bringing about effective and substantive WTO reform, because again, all of them have benefited to some extent from the free trading system under the WTO. To have a stronger, reestablished leadership of the WTO for the multilateral trading system could, in the long term, also benefit the developing countries.
Okay, we have just, I will just ask one final question, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. And the final question from me is just, how optimistic are you about the globalization continuing to do good in the near future? Let's not talk about 20 years down the line or something, but in the near future, how optimistic are you about us being able to solve some of the pretty deep problems with the system and using it to enhance American security, American prosperity, and really of people around the world?
I'm cautiously optimistic over the next, if you want to say, a near term, the next 4 to 6 years. And I think for the very simple reason, I apologize for being oversimplistic. I think it's because it's necessary. I think without globalization, or at least a modified, more practical form of globalization, it will be detrimental to the U.S. economy, economic growth, job security, national security. I mean, looking at it just from a purely commercial economic point of view, 95% of the world's consumers and 80% of the world's purchasing power lie outside of the U.S. borders. If U.S. companies are to survive and sustain jobs and economic growth, they need a global market or to be able to freely trade or to export. And if there's increasing levels of protectionism, if there's a lack of cooperative efforts, whether it's aligning with the EU and other blocs, or partners that are within these two major blocs, if there's no effort to reestablish and to refortify the WTO as an international organization that's the guardian of the multilateral trading system, I think that would be extremely detrimental to national security, to economic growth, and to the welfare of the people with jobs here in the United States. So I'm optimistic cautiously because I think the administration that we have in place now has a more practical approach to it. They themselves have said that the trade policy would be geared towards the middle class and job creation, reestablishing U.S. manufacturing base. But that involves, a smart trade policy and a realistic one, but one that engages the multilateral global marketplace.
Okay, great. Now Claire is going to join us to read some of the questions that have been submitted by the audience. If you have a question for Brian, click on the questions section in your control panel to send those in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Claire, I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jerome, and thank you for all you do for the Council of Young Professionals. We'll dive right into some more questions, though, now. So the first question is, economists once believed that globalization would lift all boats, particularly those of low-income countries. Is this still a widely held belief, or have we seen that globalization is more a modern form of empire for either countries or corporations?
Good question. I think it's a little of both in the present day form. I think an example of where globalization and the WTO and so forth like that, and its multilateral trading system, a great example of the benefits of lifting a boat is China. China, prior to its accession to the WTO in 2001, was very much a real developing country with pretty substantial levels of poverty, especially in the rural areas. And China itself will recognize that its accession and joining the WTO and the multilateral trading system benefited its economy and economic growth tremendously. And we see now that it's the number 2 economic power and soon to be number 1 in a few years on the current trends come to fruition. So I think that maybe it hasn't raised all developing and least developed countries equally, but I think you'd find it very hard to see where any one of the least developed or developing countries would say that it has not benefited in some amount by the by globalization, the multilateral trading system. On the other hand, I think there's growing criticism and recognition, not recognition, but there's growing criticism that free trade agreements, especially U.S. free trade agreements and the multilateral trading system, in the end, really only benefit the large multinational corporations such as pharmaceutical companies, Hollywood, companies that depend on intellectual property rights, market access for large multinational manufacturers, and to some degree, that I have to say that there's probably some truth to that. But I think there's a medium between the two, whereas again, I think, with recrafting certain trade policy negotiating objectives and FTA objectives, I think there could be a more equal or justifiable balance between the two extremes.
Great. Well, that's a great segue into another question, which is that the two of you focused on the three major power blocks of the US, China, and the EU, but this person is wondering more about big, large corporations like Amazon, Apple, and Google, which are extremely powerful global entities. So what responsibilities do these corporations have in general in the discussion of globalization, but also what responsibilities do they have to help rebuild the economy post-COVID-19?
Another good question. I think, and it's a difficult one to be honest with you, at least from my area of expertise. I think what you're seeing now is a lot of these questions being asked both globally and nationally within the domestic borders and within the companies themselves. What is their role? What is their responsibility? What is their obligation? I think you're starting to see some attempts, at least both nationwide, domestically, I should say, and then even internationally on how to impose certain regulations or obligations on these corporations, whether it's a form of taxes that would generate revenue that could help fund social welfare programs in the member states, whether some of these companies should be broken up. And this is again a focus, increasing number of focus both here in Washington for the United States, but also internationally as well, in other antitrust competition regulatory regimes such as in the EU. So I think it's a question that's very much in flux. I think there's a general consensus, as the person asking the question recognizes, is that there is a responsibility and obligation that should be met and implemented by these large corporations. How to do that, how to require it or to enforce compliance with such obligations and in what form they should be, I think is still very much an active debate. But you're starting to see, as I say, efforts both domestically and internationally to deal with those issues.
Yeah, and I know that you do sort of have a background in regulatory compliance, international affairs. So not just in terms of COVID-19 recovery, but also what is going to happen once climate change continues to increase. But on the other hand, there's the problem of global governance and global enforcement. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit to how the issue of climate change and climate solutions factor into these huge multinational corporations.
Another good question. So I think there's a combination of both government imposed, or there's a future and likelihood of government imposed regulatory obligations to help combat climate change. And I also think there's a social growing level of social compliance obligations as well. Let me start off with the social compliance, and that is you're seeing more and more companies having to address the concerns of stakeholders, shareholders, and having to require changes in their corporate codes of conduct or compliance programs to be more green, if you will, whether it's being more sustainable, whether it's making commitments to become carbon neutral by a certain amount of time, whether it's to make financial contributions in terms of technology and or cash to help combat climate change and promote sustainability programs. You're seeing more and more companies that are, even though maybe not legally complied to fulfill such obligations, but are socially, through social contract, through stakeholder demands and investor demands, to become more environmental friendly and be more supportive of climate change mitigation. On the government regulatory side, you're seeing countries explore, and the EU is a leader in this. And actually, back in the Obama administration, this was also considered, of imposing a carbon tax on trade, whereas where it would be as if you'd have certain standards of carbon neutrality or carbon credits, if you will, if you're an industry that has a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and there would be a carbon tax placed on how much, by the amount that you exceed those carbon gas house emissions, with import taxes to try to get companies in other markets to comply or to take stronger steps to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases. And so I think you're seeing a growing trend of both government regulatory obligatory regimes for climate change mitigation and from the social contract side and investor side.
Thank you. This next person says, I've seen many people, including Jamile, call the Hong Kong protest the first battle in the new Cold War between China and the US, or between Western ideals of democracy and freedom on the US side. If this is true, and there is an escalation of this Cold War, what does that look like economically and diplomatically, since China and the US are the two biggest players in geopolitics and global trade?
Well, I think you started seeing some of the effects even under the last couple of years of the Trump administration with the situation in Hong Kong and also in Western China and Xinjiang. And I think, it definitely will have, with the Biden administration, they've already outlaid their positions that there'll be human rights issues in the eyes of the United States will take a much more prominent role in terms of foreign policy. So I think, the economically side, I think if the tensions continue to rise, or if there continues to be higher levels of confrontation, this is part of the 3 C's I mentioned about, is I think you would see an increasing use of trade and economic sanctions as trying to impose or implement foreign policy goals in terms of human rights concerns or other social justice concerns that are, that the U.S. may have with Hong Kong and other parts of China. It's not just the U.S. either; it's the EU as well that is being put in a position of having to take a stand on some of these issues. So you definitely would have an economic impact, and diplomatically as well. We've seen the tit for tat just on the economic spillover from the economic relationship between U.S. and China, and then which led also to national security concerns with the closing of consulates both here in the U.S. and in China as a retaliation of that. So I think there's definite spillover and an increasing impact on both economic policy and foreign policy.
On the topic of a Cold War, this next question says, with the increasing tensions escalating, there is a faint hope that we are moving away from kinetic warfare, but that may be replaced by increased cyber warfare. So is there a global approach to rules of conduct around cyber warfare?
Not that I'm aware of in terms of cyber warfare. I think there are international efforts, again, among like-minded countries to take steps to regulate, cybersecurity and cyber, tools that could be used for cyber warfare, to, similar to what they have for nuclear weapons control or other types of warfare, weapons of mass destruction. But I think at best those are very nascent. And I don't think there's, at this point that I'm aware of, any international efforts to set a collection of rules to regulate cyber warfare. I think it would be very difficult to do so because you have too many other nation states that are very sophisticated. Think of, for example, Russia and others that obviously would probably not be willing to comply with any such regulations or even participate, let alone abide by any such rules. So I think it would be very difficult.
The Belt and Road Initiative will also be an important vector for globalization. Will you speak to that?
Sure, and it's a controversial one in that China is spending billions and billions of dollars for this Belt and Road Initiative throughout South Asia and through the Asia Pacific region and up through Europe. Some of these projects have come under increasing scrutiny because of the demands that come with the investment that certainly benefit these developing countries, and I should say along the coast of Africa, eastern coast of Africa as well, in terms of building up necessary infrastructure. But the terms of the conditions of the loans, the localization requirements in terms of the companies and the contractors and the employees, primarily being Chinese in some instances, and some of the political influence that that is imposed by agreeing to such investment has called into question the actual benefits to these developing countries and other countries that have participated in the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's coming under increasing scrutiny, but it also is an example, I think, of the growing battle between China and the United States in vying for influence in key regions around the world, whether it's the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific region, Eastern Africa, and of course up through Southern Europe. And so I think the U.S. is trying to come up with alternatives to, in a sense, I don't want to say buy influence, but to increase its sphere of influence in key, economic and strategic regions around the world. So I think you're not going to see the end of it, because it's a tool that both countries, I think, would continue to utilize as a way to maintain or strengthen their sphere of influence.
We rarely hear from African nations in discussions around major global transitions, instead relying mostly on the interests of, as mentioned, the US, the EU, and China. African nations have younger populations, an increasing birth rate, and a lot of room to see incredible development in the coming decades. Why aren't these nations at the table more?
It's a good question. I think, historically, they didn't have the resources, if you will, to put a lot of energy into being more participatory in global economic integration. I do think that's the reason why the WTO is a very important platform for African nations in terms of having an equal voice in terms of future negotiations for trade liberalization that could benefit African nations. I think you're starting to see efforts, sometimes maybe not for the best interest of the African nations at heart, but for example, as Jerome mentioned earlier, the example of China, buying up the cobalt resources from the Republic of Congo. I think you have geopolitical interests that would maybe at least bring attention more to Africa. I think there are well-intentioned efforts as well. I think the U.S. has begun negotiations for a free trade agreement with Kenya. Those type of opportunities I think should be pursued and elevate the position of African nations to get more engaged in global trading system. But it's a challenge, and I think one that needs to be pursued more.
And hopping over to another side of the world, can you discuss the perspective of Latin and South American countries towards the US, EU, China friction and global ambitions?
So I think this is a good example of certain countries that are being placed between a rock and a hard place. You have a lot of tugging interests involved for Latin American countries. China is certainly courting Latin American countries because they're resource rich. They're developing markets that they're developing economies that are doing well and present market opportunities for Chinese exports as well as investment in infrastructure, and of course sources of natural resource, copper from Chile, for example. At the same time, the Latin American countries have a strategic interest with and alliance, most of them do, with the United States. And so I think they're trying to walk a fine line in not antagonizing either one too much. But I think they're going to find itself increasingly in a very difficult position. And I think that's going to be the same situation that will occur increasingly in the Asia Indo-Pacific region, is where as much as these countries will try to avoid picking sides, I think if the current trajectory of the relationship continues to decline, I think these countries are going to be increasingly find themselves in difficult situations and having to choose a side or align themselves more than one side or the other. But I think right now they're walking a very fine line in terms of this power struggle between the three core powers that Jerome has referred to.
Thank you. So now moving on to the pandemic. This question is, COVID-19 jolted global supply chains and global markets. What have countries, corporations, and businesses learned, and how will they change their practices in response to such global instability?
Well, I think the key lesson that they've learned is, or at least the result of what's happening, and it started before the pandemic with the trade wars between U.S. and China, and how much it disrupted the supply chains that had been so embedded in China and neighboring countries. I mean, that started the trend towards localization or relocalization or reshoring of supply chain vendors to home countries or to at least a region, for example, like in the USMCA region, the US, Mexico, Canada region, started before with the trade wars, but was exacerbated by the pandemic effects. And I think it's going to see, along with the economic priorities now of job creation and economic growth, I think it's going to be a longer term trend of reshoring of or relocalizing both supply chain vendors and manufacturing operations themselves.
Thank you. This person comments, interesting how we leave out Japan, which we not only have a critical trade relationship with, but also a critical national security relationship with as well. I know that you have an extensive background working with Japan. So maybe you could just speak a little bit about why we haven't talked more about Japan in this conversation, and also what the future of US and Japanese relations look like at the current moment.
I think the future looks very good and will be further strengthened, again, in addressing common concerns such as China, but also climate change, defense issues, geopolitical issues in the Asia Pacific region. My lack of reference to, or more direct reference to Japan wasn't intentional. I think, for example, the U.S. Consideration of joining the CPTPP is something that Japan has specifically and strongly urged. I think the U.S. would do well to do so with that, if nothing else, to, as I mentioned earlier, in response to Jerome's comments, would re-strengthen, reshore, a very traditional strong ally, and that is Japan. I think, Japan would align, and the U.S. would find a lot of common ground and alignment, whether it's WTO reform, whether it's the CPTPP, whether it's regional globalization efforts. I think Japan would be a core and critical component of all those efforts, and reestablishing a more robust, albeit regional, multilateral globalization.
Great. Now looking a bit into domestic politics in the U.S., do Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders' popularity illustrate that anti-globalization sentiments and policies are politically advantageous to U.S. politicians? This person says both the left and the right, in different ways, seem to increasingly reject globalized policies.
I think when you say, a good question, but I think when the questioner refers to the left and the right, I think you have to be a little more specific, or I would be more specific and say that it is the extreme elements of both the right and the left. And then I would agree with you that are anti-globalization and anti-trade. Certainly, and I had a conversation with one of my colleagues the other day. For most politicians, their goal is to get elected to office, and so they're going to try to appease the voters that they represent in order to get elected. And for a lot of politicians that advocate, more protectionist policies or are anti-globalization, reflect districts that have been negatively impacted by trade, the manufacturing sector, the middle class or lower middle class, and so forth. So that's certainly understandable. But again, I think the more moderate elements of both political parties realize, that there are pros and cons to globalization. And as I mentioned earlier, just the economic basic, hard reality is that, for most U.S. companies, they're going to need to export to survive in the future, given that 95% of the world's consumers and 80% of the purchasing power of the world is outside of the United States. And so I think, as reflected by Bernie Sanders and former President Trump, yes, there are certainly as a segment of the population that is very anti-trade and very nationalistic and against any sort of globalization efforts. But I think the reality, as we were talking with Jerome earlier, is that U.S. has to engage globally and has to reestablish leadership in a way that to establish multilateral global trading system that will benefit U.S. workers, but also engages key political and strategic allies around the world as well.
Great. Well, I just realized we're right up to the end of the hour. So thank you so much for answering all of our audience questions. Jerome, I'm going to turn this back over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Claire. And thank you to the questionnaires.
Thanks, Claire. Well, Brian, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. This is a tremendously complicated topic, and you've certainly given us a lot to think about. We could probably talk about this for a whole day, really, ultimately. So thank you for, thanks everyone for joining us today and for supporting the Council. You can visit our website for more details on future events and to learn about joining the Young Professionals, as well as how to support our organization at lawacth.org. The Council needs your support to continue offering programs like these, so please consider becoming a member or making a donation. And as always, stay safe and stay informed. Thank you for joining us today.